Alright guys, good morning. Right now, I'm on my way to Camp 3 on Broad Peak. Alright, beautiful day in Broad Peak and K2 Base Camp. Thank you.
At 8,051 meters, Broad Peak is often described as one of the easier 8,000-meter peaks. That description may be exactly what makes it dangerous. There is no massive icefall like Everest, no notorious bottleneck like K2, and no single technical obstacle that seems impossible from below. Yet on July 30th, 2026, around 9:30 in the morning, Nims Dai was caught in an avalanche between Camp 2 and Camp 3, far below Broad Peak's summit. For a climber who had already conquered all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, this mountain was supposed to be another chapter. Instead, it became the final one. Welcome to Ben Stories. To understand why Broad Peak could take someone as experienced as Nims Dai, you have to forget the word easy. Broad Peak rises to 8,051 meters on the Pakistan-China border, only about 5 kilometers from K2. It is the 12th highest mountain on Earth, and its name is almost disappointingly simple. British explorers in the 19th century called it Broad Peak because of the mountain's unusually wide summit ridge. But that width is more than a geographical curiosity. It is part of the problem. The summit ridge stretches for roughly 1.5 kilometers, with several distinct high points before the true summit. A climber can reach what looks like the top, only to discover that the real summit is still farther away. And at more than 8,000 meters, farther away can mean the difference between a controlled descent and a dangerous race against time. The standard west spur route also creates a dangerous illusion. From a distance, Broad Peak appears relatively straightforward. Compared with K2's enormous walls or the complex icefalls found on Everest, its lower slopes can look almost inviting. There is no single obstacle that announces, "This is where the mountain will stop you." Instead, Broad Peak distributes its hazards: weather, avalanche exposure, altitude, crevasses, long summit days, and perhaps most importantly, the descent. That pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout the mountain's history. In 1957, Hermann Buhl and Kurt Diemberger were part of the team that made Broad Peak's first ascent. Buhl was already a legendary figure after his extraordinary solo ascent of Nanga Parbat. Decades later, Reinhold Messner would describe the 1957 Broad Peak expedition as far ahead of its time. But Buhl's story also became an early warning about the mountain environment. In 2013, another generation of elite climbers arrived during a Polish winter expedition. On March 5th, Maciej Berbeka, Tomasz Kowalski, Adam Bielecki, and Artur Małek set out from high camp. They reached the summit in brutal winter conditions. The achievement was historic, but the descent became the real test. Berbeka and Kowalski did not return to high camp. That story matters because Broad Peak repeatedly demonstrates the same uncomfortable principle. Reaching the summit is only half the expedition, and sometimes it is not even the hardest half. For Nims Dai, that lesson would become painfully relevant decades later. But before July 30th, 2026, he had already spent years proving that conventional limits did not apply to him. And that is where this story becomes much more complicated. Nirmal Purja did not arrive at Broad Peak as an ordinary climber. Born in Nepal's Mayagdi district and raised in Chitwan, he later built a career in the British military before turning his attention toward the highest mountains on Earth. His reputation was forged not simply by reaching summits, but by doing it at a pace that seemed almost impossible. In 2019, Purja launched Project Possible. The objective was extraordinary: climb all 14 mountains above 8,000 meters in less than 7 months. The traditional benchmark had been measured in years. Hurya did it in 189 days. By October 2019, he had completed the challenge, creating one of the most remarkable records in modern high-altitude mountaineering. But that was not the end. He later became part of the historic first winter ascent of K2 in January 2021, another achievement that strengthened his image as a climber, willing to operate where the margin for error was extremely small. So when Nims Dai returned to Broad Peak in 2026, this was not his first encounter with extreme altitude. He was attempting something even more ambitious, another complete ascent of the 14 8,000ers. A third round. That objective changes the psychology of the expedition. For a first-time climber, the summit may represent the ultimate destination. For someone who has already climbed every 8,000-meter peak multiple times, the question becomes different. How much risk is acceptable when the achievement itself is no longer about proving you can reach the summit? And that question becomes especially important on Broad Peak. The mountain's west spur is not relentlessly technical from bottom to top. Instead, it exposes climbers to a collection of hazards that can become serious when combined. The approach to base camp begins near Ascole and takes roughly 8 to 10 days, depending on conditions. The route passes through the Baltoro Glacier and Concordia, one of the most extraordinary mountain landscapes on Earth. Here, K2, Broad Peak, and several other giants dominate the horizon, but beauty offers no protection. Broad Peak Base Camp sits around 4,900 meters. From there, climbers gradually move upward through Camp 1, Camp 2, and toward Camp 3 at roughly 7,000 meters. And between those camps lies the problem. The mountain can look stable, while the snow above the route is not. The Karakoram is notorious for rapidly changing weather. A clear morning does not guarantee a clear afternoon. A summit window can shrink from several days to a matter of hours. Expeditions may spend weeks waiting for the right conditions. Then, suddenly, everyone moves. That creates another paradox. A narrow weather window brings climbers onto the same mountain at the same time, increasing exposure precisely when the environment offers the least room for mistakes. And on July 30th, 2026, the critical question was no longer whether Nims Dai could climb Broad Peak. It was whether Broad Peak would allow him to continue. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, somewhere between Camp 2 and Camp 3, an avalanche struck. He never reached the upper mountain. That detail is crucial. The mountain did not defeat him at the summit ridge. It happened much lower down, on terrain that many climbers might consider part of the approach to the real climb. And that is the first major lesson of Broad Peak. The most dangerous moment is not always where the mountain looks most frightening. The avalanche between Camp 2 and Camp 3 changes the way we should look at Broad Peak. At roughly 6,000 to 7,000 meters, the mountain is already operating in an environment where the human body has very little reserve. Above 6,000 meters, acclimatization can reduce some of the effects of altitude, but it does not turn the environment into something safe. Every movement costs more. Recovery takes longer. Decisions become increasingly important. And Broad Peak adds another variable: snow loading. The west spur can look broad, smooth, and relatively uncomplicated from below. But a mountain does not need to look steep to be dangerous. Snow can accumulate on slopes above a route, especially after storms or periods of shifting wind. When that snow becomes unstable, the climber below may have almost no influence over what happens next. This is why experienced mountaineers often describe avalanche terrain in terms of exposure rather than simply difficulty. A technically difficult section can sometimes be managed through skill, equipment, fixed ropes, and careful movement. An unstable slope above you is different. Your climbing ability cannot negotiate with gravity. And Broad Peak has demonstrated this before. In 2018, an avalanche near Camp 2 claimed the life of Icelandic climber John Snorri's expedition partner. More broadly, avalanche danger has remained a recognized hazard on the lower and middle sections of the mountain, particularly after significant snowfall. The important point is not that Broad Peak is constantly collapsing. It is that the mountain does not need to be constantly dangerous. It only needs to become dangerous during the short period when climbers are exposed. That distinction is critical. A mountain can be statistically manageable and still contain moments that are almost impossible to predict perfectly. And this is where the reputation of Broad Peak becomes controversial. Calling it one of the easier 8,000ers is technically understandable when comparing the route's climbing difficulty with some of its neighbors. But technical difficulty and overall risk are not the same thing. A mountain can be easier to climb and harder to survive. That may be the better description of Broad Peak. Consider what happens later on the route. Above Camp 3, climbers approach the saddle around 7,600 meters. Beyond that lies steeper terrain, and eventually the summit ridge. The route becomes increasingly exposed, and the true summit is separated from an intermediate high point by additional ridge travel. That means the summit day is not simply Camp 3. Climb, summit, return. It is a long chain of decisions. Every hour spent above 7,000 meters increases fatigue. Every delay reduces the time available for descent. Every unexpected change in weather can turn a calculated plan into a completely different problem. And Broad Peak has another psychological trap. The summit can appear closer than it really is. A climber reaches the rocky summit around 8,028 meters and may feel that the objective is essentially complete. But the true summit is still farther along the ridge. In good summer conditions, that final traverse can take another hour or more. Then comes the part that history repeatedly warns climbers about. Going down. Maciej Berbeka learned that lesson in 2013. Kim Hongbin learned it in 2021. And Hermann Buhl's story had already shown, decades earlier, that reaching the top of an 8,000-meter mountain does not mean the danger has ended. But Nims Dai never reached that point in 2026. His story ended before the summit push. And that creates the most uncomfortable question of all. If one of the world's most experienced high-altitude climbers can be caught on the lower route, what exactly does experience protect you from? The answer may be less comforting than people want to hear. Experience can improve judgment. It can improve preparation. It can help you recognize danger earlier. But it cannot remove the mountain's uncertainty. And on Broad Peak, uncertainty may be the real summit. There is another reason the Broad Peak story deserves more attention. It is not simply a story about an avalanche, or about one climber, or even about one mountain. It is a story about the limits of human confidence. Nims Dai had spent years building a reputation around pushing those limits. His 2019 Project Possible expedition demonstrated that speed, organization, physical preparation, and experience could radically change what was considered achievable in the high Himalaya. But the mountains never signed that agreement. They do not recognize records. They do not recognize fame. And they certainly do not care how many 8,000-meter summits someone has already completed. That sounds obvious. Yet it is one of the easiest principles to forget when watching elite mountaineering. The more successful a climber becomes, the more tempting it can be to interpret previous success as evidence that the next objective is manageable. Broad Peak exposes that logic. Its danger is not concentrated in one spectacular wall. It is distributed across the entire route. At around 4,900 meters, climbers begin at base camp. Around 5,900 to 6,000 meters, the route becomes more serious. Camp 1 and Camp 2 provide higher staging points. Then comes the long transition toward Camp 3, near 7,000 meters. Every altitude milestone reduces the amount of oxygen available to the body. At sea level, atmospheric pressure allows the lungs to transfer oxygen efficiently into the bloodstream. At extreme altitude, the problem is not that the air contains dramatically less oxygen by percentage. The problem is pressure. There is simply less oxygen pressure available for the body to use. That distinction matters because a climber can be highly fit and still be operating under severe physiological constraints. Then add cold, wind, fatigue, dehydration, sleep disruption, difficult terrain, and unpredictable snow conditions. The risk is cumulative. One factor may be manageable. 5 factors arriving together can change everything. This is why the idea that Broad Peak is an easy 8,000er can be dangerously misleading. Easy compared with what? K2? Perhaps. But that comparison can create the wrong mental picture. A mountain does not have to be the hardest technical climb in the world to be lethal. Broad Peak's real challenge may be that it gives climbers fewer obvious warning signs. The mountain can appear climbable. The route can appear straightforward. The weather can look acceptable. And the summit can still be many hours away. That is precisely why the 2015 decision of an experienced team to turn around after encountering unstable snow is worth remembering. Walking away from an 8,000-meter summit is not failure. In mountaineering, sometimes it is the clearest evidence of judgment. The controversial question is whether modern climbing culture always rewards that judgment. Social media rewards summits. Records reward speed. Sponsors reward visibility. Audiences remember the photograph at the top. Almost nobody celebrates the climber who turns around 200 meters below the summit because conditions have changed. Yet that decision may be the most important one of the entire expedition. And this is where Nims Dai's final Broad Peak story becomes uncomfortable. His experience was extraordinary. His preparation was extraordinary. His previous achievements were extraordinary. But none of those things could guarantee a safe passage through avalanche terrain. According to the timeline described in the reports surrounding the July 30th, 2026 incident, the avalanche struck at approximately 9:30 a.m. between Camp 2 and Camp 3. Not at 8,051 meters, not on the summit ridge, not during a dramatic final push, much lower. That is the detail that should stay with us, because it destroys one of the most persistent myths about high-altitude climbing, that the closer you get to the summit, the more dangerous the mountain becomes. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the greatest danger is waiting on a section that looks ordinary, a slope you have crossed before, a route that appears familiar, a morning when the weather seems acceptable, and then conditions change. That is why the greatest survival skill on an 8,000-meter mountain may not be climbing faster. It may be recognizing when the mountain has changed and having the discipline to change your plan with it. Broad Peak leaves us with a lesson that has little to do with records and everything to do with judgment. For decades, climbers have approached this 8,051-meter mountain because it appears, at least from a distance, more manageable than its famous neighbors. But Broad Peak has repeatedly demonstrated that technical difficulty is only one part of mountain risk. The real danger can hide in the spaces between the obvious challenges. A changing weather system, fresh snow on an exposed slope, a narrow summit window, a long descent after the body has already spent its reserves, a seemingly simple section encountered at exactly the wrong moment. That is why the story of Nims Dai should not be reduced to the idea that an easy mountain killed an elite climber. The more important lesson is that there is no such thing as an easy 8,000-meter mountain. There are only mountains with different combinations of risk. Nims Dai had already accomplished what most climbers could only imagine. He had climbed all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks in just 189 days. He had stood on K2 in winter. He had accumulated experience at altitudes where small mistakes can become major problems. Yet experience never becomes immunity. That may be the hardest truth in mountaineering. The mountain does not care about your resume. It does not care whether you are climbing your first 8,000 ER or your 42nd. It does not care how many records you hold. It only presents the conditions that exist at that moment. And the climber has to make a decision with incomplete information. That is what makes high-altitude mountaineering so fascinating and so difficult to understand from the safety of the ground. We see the summit photograph. We see the flag. We see the celebration. But the real story is often hidden in the decisions made before that photograph ever exists. When to continue, when to slow down, when to turn around, when the weather is no longer acceptable, when the snowpack is no longer trustworthy, and when ambition has begun to outweigh judgment. Perhaps that is the real contradiction of Broad Peak. The mountain looks broad, open, and comparatively simple. But its danger is precisely that it does not always announce itself. The lesson is not to fear mountains, it is to respect uncertainty. Because on an 8,000-meter peak, survival is rarely about one heroic decision. It is about making hundreds of small decisions correctly, and understanding that sometimes the smartest decision is to stop. Was the mountain misread? Was the weather information incomplete or wrong? Or did human judgment turn an uncertain warning into a decision that could not be reversed? On July 30th, 2026, Broad Peak was supposed to offer something every climber waits for, a narrow window of favorable conditions. Instead, at around 9:20 in the morning, an avalanche struck high on the mountain, between Camp 2 and Camp 3, at roughly 6,450 meters. 10 climbers were caught in the disaster, including Nims Dai, Persia, one of the world's most accomplished high-altitude climbers. But the biggest question is not simply what happened. It is what the climbers believed would happen. To understand what happened on July 30th, we have to go back several days, because the avalanche did not begin with the first movement of snow. It began with a decision. Broad Peak rises to 8,047 meters in Pakistan's Karakoram, and unlike Everest, its climbing season can be brutally compressed by weather. A summit window may appear, disappear, and return within days. Climbers do not simply wait for perfect conditions. At extreme altitude, they often have to decide whether a forecast is good enough. In late July 2026, that decision became increasingly important. The weather had already disrupted climbing plans. Summit attempts had been delayed, and teams were watching for a window that would allow them to move higher. Around July 27th, climbers began pushing upward again. Camp 1 followed. Camp 2 came next. By July 29th, the mountain was entering the critical phase. The climbers were now above the point where retreat was simple. Every additional meter increased exposure, fatigue, and dependence on the conditions around them. And this is where the story becomes complicated. Because a weather forecast does not tell a climber exactly what the mountain will do. It tells them what the atmosphere is expected to do. Those are not the same thing. A forecast can suggest wind, temperature, precipitation, or a period of relative stability. But avalanche danger depends on something much more local. The structure of the snowpack, the slope angle, recent loading, wind redistribution, temperature changes, and weaknesses that may exist beneath the surface. In other words, A mountain can look acceptable on a forecast while remaining unstable in a specific location. That distinction matters enormously on Broad Peak. Nirmal Purja understood extreme mountains better than most people alive. He had climbed all 14 8,000-meter peaks in just 189 days, an achievement that fundamentally changed expectations about what was possible at altitude. But extraordinary experience creates an uncomfortable question. Can success itself change the way risk is perceived? There is no evidence that Purja believed he was invincible, and there is no solid evidence that the other climbers simply followed him because of his charisma. But leadership matters in dangerous environments. When an experienced climber moves forward, others may naturally interpret that movement as information. If he is going, perhaps the conditions are acceptable. If he continues, perhaps the danger has been assessed. And that is the paradox. The more experienced the person making the decision appears to be, the easier it can become for everyone else to stop questioning the decision. But on a mountain like Broad Peak, experience cannot control the snow. By the evening of July 29th, the climbers were positioned high on the mountain. The next morning would become the most important morning of their expedition. And nobody knew that the margin for error had already become dangerously small. At first light on Thursday, July 30th, the situation looked different. The weather window had opened enough for several teams to move higher on Broad Peak. The climbers were heading toward Camp 3, with the summit still ahead. Reports placed the avalanche between Camp 2 and Camp 3, at roughly 6,450 to 7,000 meters. The exact time remains somewhat inconsistent across early reports. Some placed the event around 9 a.m., while initial Alpine Club reports described it as occurring around midday. The location and date, however, are consistent. That difference in timing may sound minor. It isn't. Because when you're investigating an accident on a mountain, 30 minutes can change the meaning of an entire sequence of decisions. At some point that morning, the snowpack failed, and suddenly the question of whether the forecast was good enough became almost irrelevant. The avalanche moved through the route used by the climbers, and communication with the expedition was lost. Early reports indicated that GPS data showed dramatic movement from the climbers' positions, suggesting the force of the avalanche had carried them far down the mountain. But then another problem emerged. Nobody at base camp could immediately see exactly what had happened. The mountain was blocking the answer. Weather conditions were deteriorating, visibility was limited, and helicopter operations were difficult. The rescue teams could not simply fly to the scene and determine what had happened within minutes. That created an information gap. And information gaps are dangerous in high-altitude emergencies. By July 31st, rescue teams were being organized with Pakistani military helicopters, ground rescuers, and drones. Reports confirmed that several climbers had been located, while others remained unaccounted for. But amid the uncertainty, one detail attracted enormous attention. Purja's tracking device appeared to show movement after the avalanche. For a moment, that data created hope that he might have survived the initial event. But a GPS signal is not a human voice. It can show movement without proving who or what caused that movement. And that distinction would become another lesson from Broad Peak. Technology can tell you where something happened. It cannot always tell you why. The same principle applies to weather forecasts. A forecast can identify a window. It cannot guarantee the mountain will remain stable inside that window. And this is where the human error theory becomes uncomfortable. Perhaps nobody made one dramatic mistake. Perhaps there was no single bad forecast, no reckless decision, no obvious warning that everyone ignored. Instead, there may have been a chain of small assumptions. Weather looked manageable. The route appeared usable. experienced climbers were moving, and the summit window was closing. Each assumption, by itself, might have seemed reasonable. Together, they created exposure to a hazard nobody could fully see. That is what makes Broad Peak so difficult to explain. Because the most dangerous decision on a mountain may not feel dangerous when it is made. And by the time the consequences become obvious, there may be no decision left to make. Then came the detail that may change the entire way we understand Broad Peak. The avalanche itself may not have been the only failure. According to later reporting, the disaster was not immediately recognized at base camp. A climber on nearby K2 reportedly saw the avalanche and alerted another expedition to check whether anyone on Broad Peak had been affected. But the Broad Peak team did not immediately realize that its climbers were missing. It was only later in the day, after trackers were checked, that the sudden changes in altitude raised the alarm. Explorers Web reported that roughly 10 hours passed before base camp understood the scale of the incident. That creates a disturbing but important distinction. There is a difference between preventing an avalanche and recognizing an avalanche has become an emergency. The first may have been impossible. The second may have involved human systems. And that is where the phrase human error needs to be used carefully. Human error does not necessarily mean someone was careless. It can mean information arrived too late. A radio call was missed, a tracker was not checked. Someone assumed the team was still moving normally, or simply, nobody had a reason to believe that 10 climbers had disappeared at the same moment. In extreme environments, assumptions can survive for hours because there is no one nearby to challenge them. That may explain why the rescue operation became so difficult. The climbers were not simply somewhere on a mountain. They were in an area that was difficult to access, with unstable conditions and limited visibility. Helicopters could not instantly solve the problem. Ground teams had to work through terrain, where another avalanche or rock fall could create a second emergency. And then there was the GPS data. Purja's tracker became one of the most closely watched pieces of information in the entire story. It appeared to show movement after the avalanche. For people watching from thousands of miles away, that movement created a question. Was Nims still moving? But tracking technology has a fundamental limitation. A signal is not a conversation. A point on a map is not proof of survival. The tracker could reveal movement, but it could not explain what caused that movement. And this is precisely where modern mountaineering creates another paradox. Climbers now have more information than ever. Satellite forecasts, GPS trackers, digital maps, weather models, emergency communication. Yet information does not automatically create safety. Sometimes it creates confidence, and confidence can become dangerous when it is mistaken for certainty. That may be the most important question surrounding Broad Peak. Did the technology fail? Or did humans place too much trust in what the technology appeared to say? We still cannot answer that conclusively. What we can establish is that the avalanche struck a 10-person expedition, communication was lost, and the subsequent rescue was complicated by the mountain itself. By August 1st, officials were reporting that several climbers had been located, while the search continued for the others. The mountain had already delivered its answer. But the investigation was only beginning, because if the weather was not obviously catastrophic, and if the route was not universally considered a major avalanche danger zone, then one question remained. What did the climbers know at the moment they decided to continue upward? And perhaps even more importantly, what did they not know? By August 1st, the picture was becoming clearer, but the central question was becoming harder. The avalanche had happened. The expedition had been caught in it. Rescue teams were now working against weather, altitude, terrain, and time. But where was the mistake? The simplest answer would be to blame the forecast. It is also the easiest answer to challenge. There is currently no verified evidence showing that a specific weather update incorrectly told the team the route was safe. And there is no confirmed investigation concluding that Purya or another climber knowingly ignored a clear avalanche warning. That matters, because a documentary should not turn uncertainty into certainty. What we can examine is the decision environment. The climbers were operating inside a narrow weather window. They were high on an 8,047-meter mountain. They had already invested days of effort. Turning around meant abandoning progress, while continuing offered the possibility of reaching the summit. This is where a powerful psychological effect can appear. The summit window trap. When a climber has spent enormous effort reaching a particular point, the value of continuing can begin to feel greater than the value of retreating. Not because the person is reckless, because retreat feels like losing something already earned. And experienced climbers are not immune to this. In fact, experience can create another paradox. Experience teaches you how to manage danger. But repeated success can also teach you that dangers can be managed. That distinction is crucial. Purja's career was built around overcoming conditions that many climbers considered impossible. He had repeatedly demonstrated extraordinary speed, endurance, and decision-making at extreme altitude. The Kathmandu Post described him as a figure who pushed the limits of human endurance and was driven by the belief that seemingly impossible objectives could be achieved. But that does not prove he made the wrong decision on Broad Peak. It simply gives us something worth examining. Because the mountain does not care about reputation, it does not care about previous records, and it does not become safer because the person approaching the slope has succeeded there before. That may be the deepest lesson hidden inside this tragedy. Human beings evaluate risk through experience. Mountains operate through physics. An avalanche does not know who is underneath it. And that brings us back to the original question. Was this a weather failure or a human failure? Perhaps neither. Perhaps the real problem was the assumption that one could be separated from the other. Weather creates the conditions. Snowpack determines stability. Terrain determines exposure. Technology provides information, and humans make the final decision. When those systems work together, a dangerous mountain can sometimes be climbed safely. When they diverge, even for a few minutes, the margin can disappear. Broad Peak may therefore not be a story about one terrible decision. It may be a story about how several reasonable decisions can combine into an unreasonable level of risk. And that is much harder to see in the moment, because nobody looks at a reasonable decision and thinks, this is the decision that will end everything. They simply take one more step, and then another, until the mountain makes the decision for them. By the time the full scale of the Broad Peak tragedy became clear, one thing was impossible to ignore. There may never be a single sentence that explains why 10 climbers were caught by that avalanche. The latest reporting points toward a mountain event that was extraordinarily difficult to anticipate, while also raising serious questions about the roughly 10-hour delay before base camp understood that something had gone wrong. And that distinction matters. Because blaming the weather is easy. Blaming one person is even easier. But survival in the high mountains rarely works that way. A forecast is not a guarantee. Experience is not immunity. Technology is not certainty. Leadership is not omniscience. And a summit window is never a promise. Perhaps the most important lesson from Broad Peak is that human error does not always look like recklessness. Sometimes it looks like confidence. Sometimes it looks like following a reasonable plan. Sometimes it looks like trusting information that was accurate when it was produced, but no longer accurate when the mountain changed. And sometimes the mistake is simply failing to recognize how quickly a situation has changed. That is why the question may not be, was the tragedy caused by weather or human error? The better question is, when the weather changes faster than humans can react, where does weather risk end and human responsibility begin? We may never know exactly what each climber saw, believed, or decided in those final moments before the avalanche. But we can learn from the uncertainty. Broad Peak does not teach us that experienced climbers are careless. It teaches us that experience has limits. It does not teach us that technology is useless. It teaches us that information must still be interpreted. And it does not teach us that ambition is wrong. It reminds us that ambition must always remain secondary to survival, because mountains will always offer another summit window, another route, another season, another chance. But there is no guarantee of another chance to come home. And that is the principle every climber, every expedition leader, and perhaps every person facing a difficult decision should remember. The summit is optional. Coming back alive is not. This is Ben Stories. If you found this story meaningful, stay with us for more stories about the mountains, the decisions made in extreme environments, and the lessons hidden inside them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Alright guys, good morning. Right now, I'm on my way to Camp 3 on Broad Peak. Just a quick one, as I said, everything that we design, we make, has got a functionality on the DNA. So now, what I'm going to cover about is the Nims Dai carabiner that we have designed. So, what you can see is a knot. So basically, this knot has been placed to join these two ropes together. So what you can do is, normally, you are so tired when you are climbing at this altitude without having to take your gloves to take the knot here and all that. What you can do is you can simply undo this and zoom put on the higher bit, because the carabiner is designed in such a way you can bypass the knot and you can climb. All right, beautiful day in Broad Peak and K2 Base Camp. Thank you.